Hello everyone. You're probably wondering why it is that you're reading The Wizard of Oz for an American history class. Well, I hope this presentation will help to explain that. By the way, here you see a map of the land of Oz. Notice the different areas, the Winkie Country, the Munchkin Land, Quadling Land, and the different colors associated with them. And the images here also show some of the important images of characters in The Wizard of Oz you may or may not be familiar with. These are all from the book. What I will try to do today is to identify the historical and political influences on The Wizard of Oz. And we'll address some of these key ideas, and we'll start with the author of the book, L. Frank Baum. On the left, we see an image of L. Frank Baum as an adult. Depending upon which edition of the book that you have, you might have some biographical information about Baum, and I would encourage you to read it. So he grew up in a pretty wealthy family. His dad had made a lot of money in the oil industry. But as an adult, Baum himself was not as successful as his father. He did spend time out in the West, particularly South Dakota, and he was sympathetic to some of the problems that many farmers in the United States faced. He published The Wizard of Oz in 1900, and it was an immediate success. It wasn't his first successful book, but clearly it was his most successful. And while he did not want to continue the series, he ended up writing 13 other Oz books. One of the things that we'll see is that L. Frank Baum was influenced by many different factors. Baum was married in his 20s to a woman named Maud Gage. Her mother is shown here, Matilda Jocelyn Gage. I'm showing Matilda Gage here because she was a strong supporter of women's right to vote and women's rights in general. Well, L. Frank Baum agreed with that, and in fact he was influenced quite a bit by his mother-in-law. Baum's support for women's rights is actually reflected in the Wizard of Oz books. Notice, all of the strong characters in the book are female. Even the Wicked Witches. So in the center, we see the Wicked Witch of the West. She was really strong, but she was a female character. Same with Glinda, the Good Witch. And Dorothy is only in the book, only about a 6 or 8-year-old girl. She leads around an adult male scarecrow, an adult male lion and Tin Man. She points out that the wizard is a phony, this little girl. So it's interesting how gender is portrayed in the book. Next, let's look at how farmers are portrayed. We can see some links to lecture here. Lecture number 2 addresses American expansion westward, and we see some connections that can be made to the scarecrow. So in 1862, Congress offered people 160 acres of land, basically for a minimal price. Over 400,000 people became landowners as a result of this. However, there were problems. Many of the people out west who obtained this free land did so in areas in the Great Plains and the Great Basin, and some of the areas where levels of rainfall were actually quite low. The green areas of this map identify areas of the United States where the average rainfall was at least 30 inches a year. The arrow is pointing to the state of Kansas, Dorothy's home state. Notice that the levels of rainfall were actually lower, and 160 acres really was often not enough property in order to have a successful farm. Here we see a family attempting to clear a field of grasshoppers. Work on those farms was incredibly difficult, and historians have gone back and they've noticed that, you know, if people really wanted to be successful out there in those western farms where the rainfalls were really low, you might need to work 65, 70 hours a week. Aren't prairie dogs cute? Yes, but they could also be problematic, especially when your crops are just about ready to be harvested. They've just found a brand new source of food. And so prairie dogs could, or other animals, could really wreak havoc on people's farms. So how can we link this back to the scarecrow? Well, in many ways, the farmers in the state of Kansas often faced the worst conditions at or about 1900, about the time the book was published. Many people who weren't living there thought that farmers were stupid because here they had obtained this free land. Why couldn't they make it? Out east, you could make it with a small farm that's 160 acres, but they couldn't make ends meet in Kansas because people didn't realize that the low levels of rainfall really created a lot of problems. So here we see a link to the farmer and the scarecrow because many people thought that farmers weren't very bright. The rise of industry in the United States also can be reflected in The Wizard of Oz. Lecture 3 identifies some of the working conditions faced by Americans as the nation industrialized at or about 1900. If you worked in a factory, you often began to lose your humanity because you were one of maybe hundreds of workers who worked long hours, and the conditions often were really dangerous. People often also conducted repetitive tasks again and again and again, and this led to frustration. Well, how can this be linked to The Wizard of Oz? Well, the Wicked Witch of the East enchanted the axe of a woodman living in Oz, and he began to cut off one limb after another, therefore losing his humanity, just as many American workers began to lose their humanity as they worked in these large factories. And the Tin Woodman, well, at one point, he's got to try to find a heart. I want to go back to a map of the United States. It was the Wicked Witch of the East who had enchanted the Tin Woodman's axe. Well, look at where most of those factories were located in the area that's circled. That's in the east. We can also make some direct links to politics in the United States. We can make some links between The Wizard of Oz and politics in a variety of areas. First of all, there was a political party called the Populist Party that really worked on behalf of farmers, and many members of this party supported a political candidate named William Jennings Bryan. Here we see an image of William Jennings Bryan. He was from Omaha, and he actually served as a senator from his home state of Nebraska. He was probably the best speaker of his era, and he ran for president at least 3 times, but he never won the presidency. He also was called a coward by some because he opposed American involvement in the Spanish-American War. Here we see William Jennings Bryan speaking to a large group. Again, he was possibly considered the greatest orator of his generation. Some people have argued that the wizard might represent William Jennings Bryan because the wizard was a fake and William Jennings Bryan never won the presidency. Also, they were both from the city of Omaha. Well, there's another possibility as well. Maybe politicians are represented by the Cowardly Lion. We all know that politicians often speak really well. They often promise great things, but if you back them up against the wall, they sometimes cave when problems come up. And so maybe the Cowardly Lion might represent politicians in general, and maybe William Jennings Bryan is reflected in some of these commentaries dealing with politics. There's a possibility that Native Americans are represented in The Wizard of Oz. Some people have linked the winged monkeys to Native Americans. See, before European contact, Native Americans lived all over the Western Hemisphere. Here we see a map of many of the pre-contact culture areas identified by historians and anthropologists. Before European contact, Native Americans could live as they wanted among themselves, without any outside influence. The United States government established a range of policies addressing Native Americans. There was forced removal of Indian nations like the Cherokee on the Trail of Tears. Native Americans also were forced onto reservations. And then in our class, there's the policy of assimilation that will be addressed in lecture number 2. Well, some passages in The Wizard of Oz seem to show how the winged monkeys were under the control of outsiders just as Native Americans were. Here we see from my edition from page 144. One of the winged monkeys is explaining, "Once we were a free people, living happily in the great forest, doing whatever they wanted. Later, they came to be controlled by the bearer of the golden cap, just as Native Americans were controlled by policies adopted by the United States government." Well, all of these ideas beg the question, isn't this a children's book? And aren't we just reading a little bit too much into this? Well, let's address that. You know, the book's introduction, written by L. Frank Baum, does offer a warning. And he says, you know, you shouldn't read too much into this story because it was written entirely for children. So maybe we are reading too much into it. But L. Frank Baum also loved puns. Do you find it kind of interesting that the scarecrow, who was created to protect a field of corn, was described as having a husky voice? How about the Tin Man, someone who's looking for a heart? He was described as having murmured when he spoke. Or maybe again, if we look at the scarecrow, okay, in order to create a brain for him, the wizard filled his head with bran, pins, and needles, making him sharp. And we can look at the Cowardly Lion. One time, he fell asleep in a flower bed of poppies. Here are some other ideas. The number 40 comes up in the Bible. It also comes up in The Wizard of Oz, because the Wicked Witch once sent 40 wolves, 40 crows, and 40 bees to attack Dorothy and her friends. Also, in order to enter the Emerald City, people were required to wear green spectacles. Were they maybe looking at the city through rose-colored glasses and thinking it was better than it really was? How about the description of Kansas and everything was gray and lifeless? Well, this can be contrasted with the green of the Emerald City. Why did he choose that color? Was he kind of saying the grass is really greener on the other side of, do I dare say, the rainbow? Also, the Emerald City, well, is that kind of similar to Washington, D.C.? And their favorite color there was green. And isn't that the color of money? Any commentary there? I guess the bottom line here is that many people are already familiar with the film The Wizard of Oz. Maybe you've also read the book as a child. It's possible that by reading this book, it can offer a view or a lens through which we can study an era of American history that a lot of people actually find kind of dry. And so maybe this can spice it up a little bit. I don't know. We'll see. So that's all I had for today. Here we see the map again. I hope you have a good day, and I hope you learned something new. Good luck as you begin your reading in The Wonderful Wizard of Oz.